It's pretty safe to say the 1930s really weren't a great decade, and not just for the United States. Things were terrible pretty much around the globe. In fact, they got so bad that at the end of the decade, we were involved in another world war. How exactly did we get to that point? Well, stick around because that's what we're going to talk about today in Mr. E's classroom. Hey ladies and gentlemen, Mr. E here. Today's topic is called the Rise of Totalitarianism. Specifically, we're going to do our best to answer the question, what led to the outbreak of war in Europe and Asia? Grab your pencil and paper and get ready to take some notes. Hopefully by the end of the video, you'll have a good answer to that question. To be able to answer that question, we need to know what's going on in Europe in the 1920s and 30s. In Europe, especially countries like Germany, there was a lot of bitterness over the Treaty of Versailles. Those reparations were just absolutely killing the German economy. There were several countries that were very upset about losing territory in the Great War, even though some of those countries were on the winning side. And then a lot of those newly created countries out of the Treaty of Versailles were pretty hacked off that nobody was really there helping them get started or taking up for them when they were kind of being pushed around. And on top of all this, Europe was suffering from the Great Depression just like the United States was. Some might argue that it was in a little bit worse shape than the United States was. All of those things kind of play together to kind of make this perfect recipe for the rise of totalitarian regimes or totalitarian governments. You might ask yourself, what exactly is a totalitarian government? Well, it's usually some sort of single-party government. Think like a dictatorship. The government pretty much controls everything, including the economy of the country. The government also really strictly controls the media and typically uses a lot of propaganda to talk about how awesome they are and how terrible everybody else is. They use a lot of censorship to make sure people aren't well informed. And in our case, they use a lot of schools or youth type organizations to really spread their ideas to young people, to get those ideas indoctrinated into children when they're pretty young. The person at the head of a totalitarian regime is usually called a dictator, and they typically have some characteristics that are very similar to each other. Number one, they're often very charismatic people and show a very strong public figure. They don't show a lot of weakness. They typically get everybody fired up about talking about how awesome things will be in the future, assuming you let them be in charge. And if propaganda doesn't work, these kind of people usually resort to force. So who are these leaders we're really talking about? The first one we need to mention is a guy named Joseph Stalin. He was also known as the Man of Steel. Stalin was in charge of the Soviet Union. Now remember, the Soviet Union turned communist during the Great War. Stalin is responsible for probably over 10 million deaths during World War II of his own people. Throughout his lifetime, he's generally given credit for having caused the deaths of give or take right around 200 million people. Stalin is pretty ruthless. And he stayed in power because of the fear people had for him and the propaganda he used against those he didn't like. The next guy on our dictator list is a guy named Benito Mussolini. Mussolini was in charge in Italy. He ran what's called a fascist government. We've talked about nationalism before. Fascism is an extreme nationalism, where people would literally do anything they were asked for their country, or to prove that their country was the best. Mussolini got to power by promising Italians a new Roman civilization. Now think way back to your world history days. How big and how powerful was the Roman Empire in its glory days? At one point, it ruled over the entire known world. I would say that's probably pretty powerful. Mussolini told his people that he could make that happen again. The way Mussolini stayed in power was through a group called the Black Shirts. These were basically his own private army, people that would do anything he asked of them. Now I bet you can't guess how you could identify a black shirt. If you said because they wear black shirts, you'd be right. Another thing that Mussolini really did that kind of kept him in power was he forced youth into what are called paramilitary organizations to really indoctrinate them into what he believed. A paramilitary organization is basically like kiddie army. It gets young people ready for the military, but it's really not a military in and of itself. They do a lot of the same things, except not necessarily with all the shooting and killing and exploding of stuff. The last guy we have to talk about when it comes to European dictators is Adolf Hitler. Of course, we all know he's from Germany. What you may not know is that he kind of started what he called the Third Reich. This is all part of Hitler's idea behind Nazism of the German people being superior and therefore they get to rule over everybody else. Speaking of Nazis, Hitler ran what was called a Nazi government. He founded the idea of Nazism. Nazism is really just extreme fascism. If you really want to learn more about it, you can go to the library and check out a book called Mein Kampf, or roughly translated from the German, My Struggle. This is a book that Hitler wrote while he was in prison that kind of outlines everything he believed politically. And in that it basically talks about how the German people, even though they were this superior race, had been held back and weren't allowed to do what they naturally should have been able to do. A little bit of a spoiler if you're interested in reading this book is that when it comes down to it, according to Hitler and Nazis, it's really all the Jewish people's fault. Now that is not true at all, but that's what Hitler believed. The last guy we need to talk about isn't from Europe. He's actually from Japan. He's a military leader named Hideki Tojo. In fact, he was the military leader of Japan. The way Japan was kind of set up, they had an emperor. The emperor was all-powerful. Anything the emperor said kind of went. Hideki Tojo had kind of basically climbed up to become the emperor's right-hand man. And because the emperor, to be perfectly blunt about it, really couldn't care less about running the country, Hideki Tojo kind of stepped in as the de facto leader of Japan. Tojo had this dream of creating what he called an Asian empire. He looked around and saw what European powers and the United States had done, and he said, you know what, we should be able to have an empire as well. The thing was, though, they had plenty of people. He could care less about the people. He just wanted raw materials. Materials that were able to feed factories that had already been set up in the Japanese home islands. Okay, so what do we need to take away from this? Well, number one, remember that there was a lot of bitterness over the Treaty of Versailles. Number two, totalitarian governments really control everything through just about any means necessary. And number three, remember that dictators usually have a great personality, talk big, and really aren't afraid to use force when all else fails. There you go, guys, the rise of totalitarianism. Hopefully you got good notes. Hopefully you'll be ready when we have a quiz in class. As always, till next time, guys, remember, don't stop learning.